Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Tadari Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhaivacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees, Madhavatiti Kadashi Ki Jai. So I wanted to kind of deal with a subject matter that I've dealt with a little bit before, and I would recommend that there is a question and answer session I did on the fact that the Jiva does not fall from the spiritual world. And I think in that video, which was in 2 parts, I clearly brought up this subject matter dealing with free will, but it's come up as a desire for more elaboration from a couple of different sources. One was there was some discussion of it on our phone conference. Then I had another devotee to write me asking for more clarification. And then a third devotee, actually, whose post I saw today, brought it up in the context of their inquiries about how the whole idea of the fall of the Jiva has been perpetuated and why would that be, and so forth, so on. Dandavat Sadan Siddha Prabhu. So I wanted to give some explanation of what is the meaning of free will, because sometimes whenever we look at things that are concepts within the Gaudiya theology, and then we translate things into English, sometimes the full import or purport of that phrase or word isn't, an application isn't really picked up. So it's been a common saying that the Bada Jiva, means those living entities who are living in conditional life, that they are misusing their free will. So it's very important to understand the application of our acharyas and how they applied the word free will, and also understand it from the point of view of the actual theological reality, right? So free will, in the 16th chapter of Jiva Dharma, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has mentioned it as an essential ingredient and great jewel in the samagri, or the ingredients of love of God or prema. So actually free will is a component part of love of God. So sometimes we're thinking free will means my power to execute certain things, and that's the meaning of free will. My power, I have the free will to execute certain things. And in this particular context, to love God or not love God. That's a power in the Jiva, and that power is the decisive factor in whether they go to the spiritual world, or stay in the spiritual world or fall from the spiritual world, as some people espouse, or even that it is the basis under which we can choose to act. We can either love God or not love God. That's a power we have. So I just want to be a little clear about what that actually means. So by constitution, the Jiva dasabhuti haryeva nanyasya eva karachana. Upanishads state that the Jiva is by constitution the das of Krishna and cannot be something else. So there is not a scope for the Jiva exercising a, quote, free will to establish a real identity perpetually or eternally outside of being the servant of Bhagavan. So there's not free will in the sense of swatantrita. Swatantrita means independence. The Jiva is a dependent Shakti of Bhagavan. It is a Tatashta Shakti of Bhagavan, which is dependent on the shelter of the internal energy or the external energy. It does not have an independent position. So free will here really means when one is in their constitutional position, that mood of loving God, which is one of the ingredients itself, is called free will. So why, Mukunda, then do our acharyas say that the jiva is misusing their free will? So look at the context. Free will is an ingredient of love of God, and the jiva by constitution is meant for that purpose. Not acting according to that purpose would be the misuse of something. It doesn't indicate here a power to execute that. It executes the status that a person is in. So anyone in conditional life is in conditional life based on the fact they are not in application of the principle of loving God. So don't mistake it for an independent power in the jiva. Because if you say that free will is an independent power in the jiva, that same power should allow at any given time for the jiva to say, okay, I want to love God, and right now I want that, and that should happen. There should be no necessity of a process or no necessity of a system that has to be followed. Because if it's the power to not do something, the power to do that thing should also be there in full. You understand? So the fact that there is a process, that there is a methodology to develop that love for God, means that the jiva never had the power not to love God. They could only be under the influence of a potency which would take away their understanding of their intended purpose, which is to love God. That Shakti or that energy is called avidya. So follow me here. So avidya means avidya, the removal of the knowledge of my own nature, which is by constitution the basis of foundation under which to love God. Right? I'm not dealing with the Swarup of the Jiva issue here, whether or not the prema is already inherent. I'm not dealing with that here. I'm just giving a sort of ontological presentation about the very nature of being the Das of Krishna, which is the reality. That is the basis under which love of God is manifest. You understand? So I'm saying the absence of knowledge of that reality is the basis under which we are not involved in loving God. You understand? That was not a power generated from the Tatashta Jiva. And the reason I'm saying this is because as a result of that misunderstanding of the application of this word free will, you have the opposidantic idea that people can execute that power even in the spiritual world and fall from there. You understand? That's why it's important to understand what is the application of and meaning of the word free will in Gaudiya theology. It is not swatantrata, it's not independent power. It is either the presence or lack of, by avidya shakti, the execution of one of the ingredients, which is the basis of loving God. Free will, 16th chapter of Jiva Dharma says, this free will is the jewel in the samagri of praying. It is not an independent power of the jiva. In the absence of knowledge of my constitution, knowledge and function of that ingredient of praying free will is not active. So speaking from the status of the conditioned jiva, our acharyas say you are misusing that free will. So I hope this is clear. That free will is not a power in the jiva. It is a status in the samagri of praying. When we are outside of that status of acting according to loving God, we are axiomatically or automatically in a status that can be called misuse of the free will. It's not a power that we have, which would generate a choice. Well, I think I'll love God or not love God. I'm going to choose not to love God. And therefore I'm exiled from the kingdom of God, etc., etc. It's not that kind of free will. You understand? It's not independent power. Either by your being in your constitutional reality, in which Swarup Shakti can then have Taratmic relation or Taratmic connection with the Atma, and therefore give expression of the ingredients of loving God, inclusive of free will, right? And then building on that the other samagris of prema and rasa, etc. Then that is called the actual constitutional reality of free will in the jiva. When that's not present due to avidya and the influence of the Bahiranga Shakti or external energy of Bhagavan, that status is called misuse of free will. So I've tried to explain it in different ways, and hopefully that was gotten across. Right? So it's not an independent power in the jiva. And the reason I'm saying this is because if there is that independent power, then the jiva should have the ability, because if you could misuse your free will and become, let's say, anadi bada, you can therefore be from time without any beginning conditioned based on, quote, I'm just giving an example here, based on that power should also be there to reverse that with an instantaneous arrangement. Yes, I chose not to love God and I choose to love God, therefore love of God to be manifest. So it should not require a process, etc., but it does, because from Anadi Kal, the jiva has been not in the status of the position to love God. You understand? From Anadi Bada, means from time without any beginning, the jiva has been involved in the arrangement of dealing with the material energy. In Bhagavad Gita 13:20, this is clearly mentioned, and in the Tika Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Pad, he clearly asks and answers the question about the why, the why and when the jiva became involved like this. So the verse is Prakriti Purusham Chaiva Vidi Anadi Uboapi. So this connection between the jiva and Prakriti is Anadi. Vikrama cha gunang chaiva Vidi Prakriti Sambhavam. The material nature and the living entity are both eternal, and their connection is also eternal. We described that from Srimad Bhagavatam 11:22-10. Anadi avidya yuktasha purushasya vedatmadam. And also in that verse, as I've quoted many times, it's clearly mentioned there to prove my original point about free will not being a power in the jiva. The third line of that verse, Srimad Bhagavatam 11:22-10, says, Swato na Sambhavanti Anya. The word Anya means another person, right? But Swato na Sambhavanti. The individual jiva has no power to exercise, quote, free will to extricate themselves from material energy. So this was my point. If it is a power in the jiva, it should work both ways. The power to not love Bhagavan and the power to love Bhagavan. And they should be equally expedient in their efficacy. So if I chose at some point, which is back to defeating the apasidantic idea of falling from the spiritual world, if I chose at some point not to love God, and that produced a situation of falling into the material world from time without any beginning, right? Similarly, when I choose, I want that love back, right? So why does it have to be a process? So that power, which was so powerful, it could generate activity contrary to the very nature of the spiritual world, but yet in relation to the material energy, it doesn't have the same power. No, I want to love God, boss, that's it. And I'm just immediately back in my original status in the spiritual world. Right? If that was the actual philosophy, which it's not. Right? So the point here being that free will, the way it's being applied by our acharyas, is to indicate a status of the jiva, not an independent power in the jiva. You understand? So when that status changes due to the influence of a sadhu, right? What is the verse? I think it's that Bhava Apavaga Brahmato Yad Bhavaj Janashatarahi Achyuta Satsangamaha in this shlok. That when we come in contact with Achyuta Satsangamaha, with Satsanga, means Achyuta Satsangamaha means those who are in the line of serving Bhagavan, then we should understand Yat Bhava Apavarga, that the cycle of samsara has come to an end. You understand? When you meet the pure devotees, to be understood, that cycle of Apavarga means going through the cycle of samsara has come to an end. You understand? That's the indication. When you meet the sadhu, it has come to an end. Now, the jiva who was from a nadikal condition, having met the sadhu and having been influenced by the prabhav, means the influence of Swarup Shakti in the form of Shraddha, can now break that abhinivesh, which the word abhinivesh means an inextricable absorption in something. So abhinivesh in relation to avidya means, abhinivesh in relation to the material world is a feature of avidya, and it means an inextricable power, which does not allow the jiva, swato nasambhavanti, doesn't allow the jiva to extricate themselves from material energy. But now, under the influence of the prabhav of Swarup Shakti coming to a sadhu, Shraddha Anupayani Varajam Bhakti Unmukhi Chitta Vritti Visesh. The Chitta Vritti, the function of our consciousness, can now break away from that connection and begin the process of actually unfolding in the use of the free will, which is part of the samagri of love of God. You understand? So, once the sadhu appears and the influence of Swarup Shakti is there, in the leanest and thin way, praying manifests as Shraddha. Shraddha, when it gets to its mature state, Shraddha Shabde Vishwashkohe, Shudrida Nishtoy, Krishna Bhakti Koele, Savakama Krita. The mature stage of Shraddha is praying. That in this Paramatik Shraddha, the mature stage of Shraddha, one has no other consideration except serving Krishna. Meaning, Radha Dasyam, for those in this line, but that's the actual meaning of Shraddha. So in its first iteration, its thin, minute particle, it is the beginning of Shraddha, right? Which first comes is the accumulation of Bhakti Unmukhi Sukritis, so Ado Shraddha. Then they formulate into the actual connection with the sadhu, in which the actual substantive part of our Sukriti now manifests as an actual contact with sadhu, in which hearing the Harikatha Shraddha develops. Right? Because before that, the Bhakti Unmukhi Sukritis, Bhagavat Bhaktis tu Samgena Parajayate, Satsanga Pumriya Prapyate, Purva Sukriti Sanjate, in this verse. That from Sukriti you get Sadhu Sangha, and from Sadhu Sangha one gets Shraddha. And that Shraddha is the beginning of the sojourn of the Jiva towards their actual constitutional position and the breaking away from the artificial connection with the material energy, the vicarious artificial connection with the material energy. So, free will again is not a power in the Jiva. It is a status of the Jiva. The power in the Jiva to break that status of, quote, misuse of free will comes from the influence of Swarup Shakti via connection with a sadhu. So the power is actually Swarup Shakti, and that is the prabhav, means the influence of it, coming through a sadhu. You understand? So that power is not something in the Jiva. I made a decision, I don't want to love God, and that's why I'm here. And then when I made a decision to love God, okay, that's when things begin to happen. Right? But it appears that way. In our practical existence, it appears like choices we're making. You understand? But actually, everything is actually being carried out in the material energy by material nature. Prakriti kriya monani gunai karmani savasha aham karvi mudatma kartamiti manyate. The karta in material energy is the three modes of material nature. And the karta in spiritual energy actually becomes the jiva empowered by Swarup Shakti. So when Jiva Goswami described 21 qualities of the jiva, he described Jnanatva, Bhoktatva, and Kartatva as one of those elements. You understand? So Kartatva means the power to do something. Right? So it's the execution of free will by the influence of Swarup Shakti. You understand? The power is actually coming from the influence of Swarup Shakti when we begin to sojourn in Bhakti. And then the actual manifestation of love of God is actually the descent of Swarup Shakti itself, which then manifests the power in the Jiva to express the free will as an ingredient to loving Bhagavan. You understand? So, I just wanted to make this point clear because quite a few, one, we discussed it as I mentioned on our phone conference, then somebody wrote me about it, then another very nice devotee was making general inquiries about this subject matter. Yesterday, he replied to an earlier question he had, and he also brought up this point about why there's the understanding of free will the way it's been understood or been made to appear to be something that could even be the cause of the jiva falling from the spiritual world. So hopefully this was clear now, that free will is actually a samagri and praying. Mukunda, where'd you get that from? Read, of course, 16th chapter of Jiva Dharma. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur makes it crystal clear that free will is an ingredient of praying. The application of the term misuse of free will by our acharyas, I've explained extensively here, has been to describe the status of the Bada Jiva. That where the Bada Jiva has the constitutional propensity to love God, when that's not happening, that status is called misuse of free will. So it's not a power in the Jiva. Understand? But Mukunda, wait, couldn't it be said that I'm choosing not to surrender? I'm choosing not to do this. Or I'm choosing to do this. Actually, that powers or that energy is coming from one or two places. It is coming from, in material energy, the three modes of material nature. And because the jiva is entrapped in those three modes of material nature, almost like a rag doll, the jiva is being controlled by it. In Bhagavad Gita, it's mentioned there. What is it? Jiva bhuta, let me read this whole verse. Mamam so jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana. Manak shashta indriyani prakriti stani kalshati. Kalshati means like a struggle. So the jivas, they are mama angsa, Krishna says. They're his own parts and parcels, meaning they're to touch the Shakti of Bhagavan. Right? And their status as being jiva, to touch the jivas, is eternal. Right? Mana shashta indriyani. Through the facility of the chitta. Mana here means mind, but chitta is the actual indication. They're constantly dealing with the senses. Shashtan indriyani means the six senses, which is inclusive of the mind. Right? They're constantly dealing with that prakriti, stani, kashati, being situated in material energy, kashati, in a struggle because of the vicarious connection between the two. You understand? So what's going on within material energy is the influence of the three modes of material nature. That's also not a power of the jiva. And similarly, when the jiva has a desire by the influence of Sukriti, the potency of Sukriti, a desire arises in the jiva. What else is there besides this material world? Keyami, kenyamai, jaritapatrai, like Sanatana Goswami Pada asked Mabu, who am I and why am I suffering? This stage is called Mukti, right? It's like the beej of the Bhakti Lata, the seed of the Bhakti Lata. This discrimination, who am I and why am I suffering, gives rise to finding the answer, which is then, of course, by Bhakti Mukhi Sukritis coming in contact with a sadhu, who then gives revelation. Jivera Surupaya Krishna Nityadas, you're the Nityadas of Krishna. You're suffering, Jivera Tatasta Shakti Dera Ved Prakash. Because of you being Tatashta Shvabhav, you were influenced by the external energy. That's why vicariously you're thinking I was suffering. That suffering is actually not in your Atma. It's in your misconception of yourself related to the three modes of material nature. Now that you understand something, then the sadhu will progressively give descriptions to guide you in bhakti, right? And in guiding you in bhakti, gradually you'll come to know what is my constitution. By knowing my constitution, more and more the spiritual influences gives rise to the organic kartitva that you have in your nature to serve God, right? And that kartitva is a power coming from Swarup Shakti into the heart of the, or consciousness of the jiva, to have the power to serve Bhagavan. You understand? So I think hopefully this point was made clear. It's really a subtle thing because generally when we hear common parlance of something, common language something, it's difficult, right? Just like the term, going back home, back to Godhead. So by all common parlance in English, going back to some place indicates having been there before. But certainly we know that our Srila Prabhupada didn't mean that, because in the 28th chapter of Krishna books, he writes, when one becomes mature in devotional service and becomes realized, he meets Krishna and has direct association for the first time. So that would completely be contradictory. So we know that we have to then look at everything through the prism of our Siddhant. That way we get a clear picture of the application of English parlance that's used by our acharyas. Like words like going back home, back to Godhead, or misuse of free will, or by nature everyone is a lover of God. Right? We have to then take the sayings and look at their understanding through the prism of Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra. Because then what was spoken will have clear context and won't give rise to confusing Siddhantic ideals. Oh, we fell out of the spiritual world and we had free will there, right? And then if we had enough cognition in the spiritual world to have realized Krishna, his abode, his dham, his associates, then looking at the material energy would have naturally given rise to the fact that it's inferior. And if we say we didn't have enough cognition to do that, then how do we have enough cognition to realize this is Krishna's Leela and the nature of it? You understand, so many Siddhantic incongruities come when we're not clear about these things. You understand? And there you find people starting to make up different kinds of conjectures and concoctions to try to couch that misunderstanding. Well, we really didn't know what we were getting into when we came to the material world. We were cognizant enough, our consciousness was fully blossomed enough to be in the actual experience of the absolute reality, but that same level of cognition could not accommodate the inferior nature of the relative material world. Does that make sense to anybody? So, I don't know, but these are the kind of things that go on. So anyway, my point here, I don't want to belabor this. The point was to understand free will. So in summary again, one more time, free will is an ingredient in love of God. This is confirmed by Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Again, I'm mentioning 16th chapter of Jiva Dharma. How does that relate to the Jiva? Well, when our acharyas use it, they relate it to the status of the Jiva. If the Jiva is an Anadi Bada Jiva, it is considered in that status the great jewel of one of the ingredients of love of God, an essential ingredient, is not being applied here. Therefore, you're misusing the opportunity, might be a better word, misusing the opportunity to express the kartatva or free will that comes in relation to loving God. You understand? So this status is a misuse of free will. It is not a power in the jiva. Yes, Prabhuji, that's a very good example. One devotee is giving an example here. Prabhuji is giving an example that going back home, back to Godhead, is very much like the parents telling a baby who was born in a hospital, okay, let us go home. And, the baby's never been to the actual residence of the parents is the point here. So going back home really is a new experience for the baby. You understand? But constitutionally, in the context of that baby being the child of those parents who have that home, that's the context it is. And that's the same thing our Srila Prabhupada used the phrase going back home, back to Godhead, which was originally, by the way, something that he had gleaned from the Archbishop of Canterbury in relation to the social dynamic of people becoming godless and the need for people as a whole to socially reorient themselves towards serving and loving God. Right? So it was really a social statement, more or less. Right? How society should re-gear themselves towards God. It was never meant as a theological description of the Jiva and a history of the Jiva's fall and return or any of that sort of stuff. Now, some of that may have arisen in our theology due to, you know, the whole sort of Judeo-Christian ideals of, you know, Adam and Eve falling from heaven and going back. And so, you know, there may be many influences that may have caused that, right? But, you know, overall, Gaudiya theology does not accommodate the idea of falling out of spiritual and breaking a relationship with Krishna, etc., etc. All right. So, Dandavat Pranam, devotees. Have a very blissful Ekadasi, if it is Ekadasi Vrat for you today. Jai Vancha Kalpatrubhishcha Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Pavanavyo Vaishnavevyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.